Hi, welcome to the Pursuit of Truth. Strange times we live in. I suppose they've always been strange times to someone. But just recently with the massacre on October the 7th and the war in the Gaza Strip, us all live seeing these harrowing pictures of suffering, whether it is from October the 7th or from the bombs being dropped and children in rubble and all these different institutions and protected places being hit, war being done in a way we've never really seen it, as if we're soldiers on the field witnessing these things. And obviously that's why there's lots of protest every weekend. There's protests, and Suella Braverman has called them hate marches, and Jews and Muslims alike are in European and Western countries are being targeted and are feeling unsafe. They're almost like history is repeating itself. It feels like, when you did history and you saw the 1930s with the rise of Hitler and the Nazis, like we're back at that time. There's so much hate going around, so much mistrust. You're going to hear these bits I heard from Sky News where they're talking about, the idea of democracy and extremism and protest, all those things that are meant to be freedoms of, in the system that we live within. Although I don't agree with the system we live in, I think that's part of the problem, but in the system we live within, we're meant to be able to protest and meant to have freedom of speech, within reason. When we see something harrowing, then we should be able to talk about it. But now they're talking about, a lot of truthers are now going to be extremists because they want to expand that and make people who go against the government extremists. It's like we're coming like Russia and China. We've been moaning about them and their freedoms and press freedoms and people freedoms, and now we want to impose it upon us. Maybe this won't go through, but it's a worrying time. Suella Braverman talking about hate marches, whereas most of the people at these marches are peaceful people who just don't want to see people suffering. They probably don't even have any view on Israel-Palestine or two-state solution or anything like that. Yeah, there's going to be those racists, there's going to be those people who want to hijack it, and there's going to be the media who want to concentrate on those ones to try and make it like that. And Suella Braverman doing the same thing, concentrating on those things because then you can win your argument. Confirmation bias, but I know she's worrying all these different things. A refugee camp that was struck for one Hamas leader killing hundreds of people, including women and children, and that was justifiable by the IDF, Israel's military force, and no one did nothing about it. The media highlighted it. Governments are still saying Israel has the right to defend one person. Is that correct? Is that fair? You can take out one person whilst taking out hundreds of other people in a refugee camp. And now an ambulance struck because there may have been people in there who were working for Hamas. Maybe that's how they ferry around. It might be possible, but it doesn't look good. But it killed innocent people around it, and maybe they were injured themselves. And of course, then they're not. You're not allowed to do that in the Geneva Convention. We're living in very worrying times, and it seems to be escalating out into lots of different areas, as you're going to hear now.
Good afternoon. It's been 4 weeks since Hamas launched an attack on Israel, breaking through the Gaza border, killing 1,400 Israelis and taking over 200 people hostage. Since then, Israel's military response has forced much of Gaza's population to flee south, and Hamas says nearly 9,500 Palestinians have been killed, including nearly 4,000 children. In the latest fighting, an Israeli airstrike targeted a convoy of ambulances. Hamas say at least 15 people were killed. Israel says it was targeting Hamas operatives. Well, our correspondent Mark Stone is in Jerusalem for us. Mark, we've seen Antony Blinken today. He's been meeting regional leaders in Jordan. What has he been saying?
Yes, after a day in Tel Aviv yesterday, he moved to Jordan, where he has been focusing his attention on the Arab nations who have gathered. A meeting of foreign ministers and indeed some Arab leaders have travelled to Jordan at the invitation of King Abdullah, where they will be holding urgent talks with the US Secretary of State, where they will be calling for him to call Israel to have a ceasefire or at least a humanitarian pause. A pause is what Antony Blinken and the American President Joe Biden have been calling for in recent days. But it is quite clear over the course of the day yesterday, while he was here in Israel, that Israel does not want even to see a pause in the fighting. The backdrop to his visit is an extraordinary level of bloodshed down in Gaza now, 4 weeks after that moment on the 7th of October, when for Israel everything changed. The bloodshed in Gaza, the retaliation since, has been relentless. My report contains images of an airstrike from the very start.
Israel's battlefield is now the front entrance of Gaza's biggest hospital. Among the dead from their airstrike are women and children. We know that because we can see them in images that we could never broadcast. It is a horror and a hell that is hard to comprehend. According to Gaza's health ministry, a convoy of ambulances was trying to drive south, taking the wounded to Egypt when it was hit. A doctor speaking to us from the hospital described the scene.
It's still chaos in the emergency department because there were so many bystanders, nobody knows. That part of it's the only gate into and out of Shifa, and it turned into a bit of a market there.
There was no denial from the Israelis. They did this, they say, because they had to, because they claim the ambulances were carrying terrorists. They have repeatedly said that Hamas is using the hospital as a base and that they have warned civilians to leave.
See you.
Just a few hours before the strike, a little over 100 miles to the north in Tel Aviv, America's top diplomat was back to meet Israel's prime minister. The two held private talks, where we're told the US Secretary of State did urge restraint. There was a meeting with Israel's war cabinet. And then a news conference, a reiteration of America's full support for Israel's war, and some words of caution.
As Israel conducts its campaign to defeat Hamas, how it does so matters. It matters because it's the right and lawful thing to do. It matters because failure to do so plays into the hands of Hamas and other terror groups.
And yet, for all that, the Israeli Prime Minister said they would continue with all their power. And listen to this from a key member of the war cabinet.
Everything that happens in Gaza right now is rightly connected to both the great Hamas and release all the rest are simply details.
But they're not details, there are lots of civilians dying.
The details he talks about amount to a reported 10,000 dead now in Gaza. This is the coastal road in the Strip. It was the only route south still open. Reported Israeli shelling hit at least one car in a convoy. The images show children among the dead. The Israeli military is now deep inside Gaza and underground. Their own footage, we're told, shows Hamas tunnels they've discovered. And in Jabalia, they say they uncovered detailed militant plans. And then there's this from the other side, from Hamas. This is a war that is being recorded from their helmets. For those who have managed to move south into the so-called evacuation zone, it is just the same. This is Khan Yunis, the place that is supposed to be safe. Men, women, bundles. And this is what fortunate looks like in Gaza. A young girl, revealed from the rubble. She is alive, but reciting her prayers, preparing to die.
Now, a little bit of positive news being reported by the Reuters news agency in the last hour or so. They are quoting the Israeli military as saying that they will allow Palestinian evacuees to use the main Gaza highway south between 11 GMT and 2 GMT today. So space, I mean, you know, some might say this is a humanitarian pause. It's certainly not a humanitarian pause of the type that people are calling for. But it is movement on the behalf of the Israeli military saying we assume that they will not be striking that area between those times to allow people to move south. But then, as we saw in my report there, they are already striking in the south. Khan Yunis is the destination. It's where they all want to get to at the bottom end of the strip. And that is clearly extremely dangerous. And they are striking ambulances in the north as well. And I was struck by the fact that very quickly the Israeli military yesterday said, yes, we did hit a convoy of ambulances and we had every right to, because they claim there were Hamas terrorists, their words, inside that ambulance. They say that the ambulance, they had surveillance which proves that there were terrorists in that ambulance and therefore they had the right to take it out. The questions, though, remain. Where is the evidence of that? Will they provide it? Maybe. We will see. Did they know that there would be so many civilians around that ambulance and indeed other ambulances in the convoy who would be at risk of dying as they did? These are questions which the Israeli military has not yet answered.
Mark Stone, for now, live in Jerusalem. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's get more on that airstrike on a convoy of ambulances that Mark was just referring to near a hospital in Gaza. Hamas says at least 15 people were killed and 60 injured. Well, I'm joined now by our military analyst, Sean Bell. Sean, ambulances hit sounds horrific, of course it does. But with this war, can we be so certain that Hamas militants weren't involved?
Yeah, good morning, Simon. It's a fascinating question. I mean, yesterday, let's do the facts first. Yesterday, the IDF did strike an ambulance convoy. They admitted to doing that. 15 killed, 60 wounded. It was near the Al-Shifa hospital, which is just up by the coast there. It's the biggest medical facility in the region. Now, the IDF claims that Hamas fighters, and several of them were killed, and that they routinely use ambulances to ferry around their fighters and their weapons. Now, from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Authority, they said they were actually carrying injured personnel for treatment in Egypt, which we heard earlier, that the convoy was actually struck at the hospital gates and about a mile and a half down the road as well. They claimed that the convoy route had already been cleared through the Red Crescent Organisation. It's worth pointing out that the Palestinian Red Crescent Organisation is part of the International Red Cross, and they've claimed that this would be a breach of the Geneva Convention.
How does this tie the information war? Because obviously that's really important, isn't it? Once you hear about schools or hospitals or ambulances being hit, that's the line that sticks. But there could be so much more going on there.
You're absolutely right. You know, it's the headlines are one thing, it's quite another when you actually get the facts behind. And it's also interesting on this particular case, if wounded Hamas soldiers were in the back of that ambulance, they're not a target, because the rules of armed conflict, absolutely, you need to look after your injured, even if they're carrying their weapons. But in the information war, both sides are trying to manipulate the media on this, and the truth gets lost along the way. And it's often the first to message that actually resonates. I'm going to look at an example, which is the Ali Arab Hospital, which, if you remember, on the 17th of October, there was a big explosion in the parking lot outside that. Now, Hamas immediately blamed the IDF. And of course, that message resonated and caused all sorts of passions to be inflamed around the Middle East. When you look at the hard evidence, the cold evidence of what happened, it looks almost certain that wasn't conducted by an Israeli rocket, and almost certainly was emanated from a rocket that was fired somewhere within Gaza. But of course, by then, the damage has been done. People believe what they want to believe, but it does show the pivotal importance of the media in this conflict.
And the Palestinian Red Crescent Society has said that deliberate targeting of medical teams is a war crime. What is your assessment?
The term war crime is incredibly emotive, and part of the reason is that we've been reporting on Ukraine for 18 months, and of course President Putin's been indicted by the International Criminal Court because of war crimes, but he wasn't indicted for bombing buildings and civilians and the like. What he was indicted was because some of his fighters were actually murdering prisoners that had their hands tied behind their back, they're on their knees, and they were just executed, whether it's soldiers or civilians, and then dumped in mass graves. That's a completely different issue. And that in war, which is what Prime Minister Netanyahu's declared, there's a blurring of the lines between the civilian and the military population. Now, the law of armed conflict still applies, but the law is not specific. It uses generic terms like care should be taken, avoid and minimize civilian casualties. Therefore, things like Netanyahu saying clear out of the north probably provides them enough cover. The West as well, our assessment, we're used to the last 70 years wars of choice, counterinsurgencies, that's all hearts and minds. You're incentivized not to kill the civilian population because you lose the campaign. Whereas this country, it's over 75 years since we had a war of national survival. That's what Netanyahu's framing this as. And of course, that's a completely different kettle of fish. The ICC will ultimately decide where war crimes have been committed, but that will be after the conflict. Meanwhile, this is just a harsh reminder of the brutality of warfare in a modern age.
Yeah, it's incredibly brutal. It's incredibly distressing. Thank you very much for making a little bit more sense of it militarily. That's Sean Bell. Thank you very much indeed. Well, here in the UK, the chief rabbi has accused some pro-Palestinian protesters of standing alongside extremists. Tens of thousands of people are expected to join marches today across the UK calling for a ceasefire. Well, let's speak to our political correspondent, Rob Powell, who's in Westminster for us. Rob, are the police going to have quite a job on their hands in London today?
I don't think there's no march going on in London today, or no central big national march. It's a protest that's arranged for Trafalgar Square, which could take in several smaller demonstrations going on around various boroughs in London. There's also a number of individual protests going on in other cities right across the country as well. The bigger protests may come a week today, but the Met Commissioner has said that if anything, the policing operation may well be ramping up a little bit. He's saying that their approach will get sharper, is the word that Sir Mark Rowley used, because of the cumulative impact of the fact that these protests have been going on for quite a while now, for several weeks, and the potential impact that could have on community tensions. There's clearly been a little bit of tension as it is between the Met and ministers, certain government ministers suggesting that perhaps the Met could take a more robust approach on some of these protests. Clearly, most of the demonstrations we've seen so far have gone off largely peacefully. There's been a relatively low number of arrests and charges, although we have, of course, seen just yesterday 2 women charged in connection with alleged glorification of Hamas, which, of course, is a proscribed terror group in the UK. And I think that's what the Chief Rabbi, Sir Ephraim Mervis, is referring to in this piece he's written for the Times newspaper, when he talks about a minority displaying extremism and the majority standing next to them. I'll read you some of his article in the newspaper. He said, at the very least, the lines between those who wish only to advocate for the welfare of innocent Palestinians and those who support the brutal terrorism of Hamas have become badly blurred. It's a stain on our common humanity that so many seem to have lost sight of the moral distance between Hamas and Israel. Now, I mentioned the march that's due to take place, the national march in London, a week today. There's been some political concern over that because of the fact that it is also Armistice Day a week today, so there'll be commemoration services going on Whitehall in Westminster near to the Cenotaph. And Rishi Sunak has written to the Met Commissioner, essentially reminding the Met Commissioner of some of the powers that he has to potentially curtail or even completely ban that protest, and indicating pretty heavily as well that the government would be prepared to back the Metropolitan Police up if they did decide to ban that protest. Rishi Sunak saying that any demonstration on Armistice Day would be provocative and disrespectful. At the moment, it doesn't appear that the Met are minded to do that. There has to be intelligence or evidence indicating that there would be serious public disorder being caused. And because the marches for the last few weeks have been largely peaceful, that really isn't there at the moment. The organisers of the march next week also say they've been talking to police and the route won't go anywhere near the Cenotaph or Whitehall, and that also it will take place several hours after the remembrance services are taking place.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see next weekend and how police deal with any protests. Rob Powell, for now, live there for us in Westminster. Thank you very much indeed. Now, an earthquake hit.
I mean, it seems like to protest is not allowed anymore in this country.
My news.
I mean, maybe if they actually listened to... did I put this in the right place? Maybe if they actually listened to the protest and followed what the will of the people wanted. No, why would they do that? Rather than doing that, let's change the law. Let's like this next piece where it talks about rebranding, terrorism or extremism as anyone who goes against the government. I mean, what are we in? Is it Kafka territory or Orwellian territory here? Russia, China, what we moan about them, and we want to bring that here and say that you must, well, basically it's saying you can't protest about what you want to protest about, even if it's peaceful. And I mean, and there's the rabbi trying to sort of blur the lines. I think most people there, that they would understand that what happened on October 7th was a massacre, and that Hamas is a terrorist group. I think most, 99%, them. Obviously there might be a few that don't. But they're protesting because of, they're against war and what happens at war and the casualties. No?
Tonight, ministers are urging the regulators that oversee public bodies like the NHS and charities to crack down on hate speech amid the Israel-Hamas conflict. Well, our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is in Westminster for us. John, good to see you. What more can you tell us about this?
A group of senior ministers have written some letters to the regulators of the NHS, medical bodies, charities, and in education, universities in particular, warning about hate speech, in particular concerns about anti-Semitism. Now, the crackdown affects the NHS, universities and charities principally, and what they want, the government wants, is to combat professionals promoting hate speech after the October 7th massacre. So, first of all, Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, has written to the General Medical Council and the Nursing and Midwifery Council, warning that, in his words, hate speech and support for extremism or terrorism are not compatible with being a UK doctor or nurse. Secondly, Lucy Fraser, the Culture Secretary, now her department oversees the Charity Commission. She's written to that watchdog saying that charities promoting extremist narratives risk undermining our wider system of charity regulation, she says. And thirdly, Robert Halfon, he's the Universities Minister, he's revealed in the Sunday Telegraph that he's due to meet the Office for Students, that's the body that regulates universities, to discuss his concerns about anti-Semitism on campuses. He fears there's an invisible ghetto of Jews being created who are too afraid to participate in university life. Now, all this comes a few days before the King's speech, and it's highly probable that in that the legislation announced by King Charles on Tuesday, 7th of November, there may be some legislation with a new definition of extremism. This is something Suella Braverman and Michael Gove, the Communities Secretary, have been looking at for a few weeks now, because police, Sir Mark Rowley said on Sky News last weekend, the old terrorism definition doesn't really cover extremism. And so what they're looking at is a definition of extremism which will mean that anyone who undermines the country's institutions or values would be guilty of extremism. So the government, in response to calls from Sir Mark Rowley and other police chiefs, is looking at the tightening of the law there. So a double crackdown, if you like, professional bodies, regulators, and at the same time, a tougher law on extremism.
John Craig with the latest there from Westminster. John, thank you. Hamburg Airport.
And you've got to remember that there's a lot of policy that UK have done over the years that has been abhorrent, like slavery and all sorts of things. So if you were in that time, you have to just back it. If you think that, that would mean, like someone mentioned when they went through newspapers, if you're against the monarchy, well, that's an institution in the UK. So what would that mean? You're an extremist because you want people to be equal.
The administration is going to discover that despite all the support, I think Netanyahu is going to ignore them, at least for the foreseeable future.
Now, we've seen Antony Blinken appearing alongside foreign ministers in Jordan today. The Jordanian foreign minister accusing Israel of committing war crimes, and certainly the news coming out of Gaza grows more and more grim every day. Is this an uncomfortable position for Antony Blinken to be in on the world stage, having these accusations levelled at Israel without any power, it seems, to do anything about it?
Absolutely. I know the Secretary of State. I worked in the State Department, as you mentioned, for a decade. Tony knows what's happening. He must be very uncomfortable. Look, this is a foreign policy personality that has worked on other conflicts, such as the situation in the Ukraine, the Syrian conflict. He has spoken in a forthright manner regarding the atrocities committed by other governments vis-a-vis their neighbors or their own people. And, the scenes out of Gaza, to me, as someone who has worked on Syria, are identical to what we saw in Aleppo or Homs, or what we're seeing now in Ukraine in some of the cities. And therefore, it must be extremely uncomfortable. And I know that people inside the administration, inside the State Department, senior level advisors have communicated to me personally that they felt very distant from the current policies.
Okay, amid the harrowing statistics that we hear on a near daily basis at the moment, 3,700 children killed in Gaza in the last 4 weeks, more than in all the world's conflicts combined. Is America's position to support Israel at all costs becoming untenable here?
We say that every time we get ourselves into these situations. We've seen it in Gaza before. We've seen it even in southern Lebanon in the past. I think that it is increasingly becoming very apparent that there must be some guardrails. There has to be rules of the game that the United States must also, abide and not only recommend, but enforce even with its strongest allies. I mean, this to me reminds me of the war in Yemen, where the U.S. for a number of years provided unconditional support to the Saudi Emirati coalition. And after it became very apparent that many civilians were dying and there was a famine and completely destroyed infrastructure, even the U.S. administration backed away, limited the provision of offensive weapons, and essentially began to even oppose the way the war was being prosecuted. I think we're going to get there in Gaza, but I really am very concerned how many more children would have died by then.
Now, before I let you go, I just need to ask you about some of the American nationals stuck in Gaza. You say, of course, you worked for the State Department for a number of years. Some of those American citizens or dual nationals have now filed lawsuits against the State Department because they remain stuck in Gaza, unable to be evacuated. Will that make any material difference, filing a lawsuit? And is American public support for what's happening in the Middle East waning?
Yeah, I think the impact on such lawsuits is more of a impact on the public sentiments, on creating political pressure on the administrations to do more. Now, I know that the administration and the State Department are doing everything they can to get these American citizens out. I have no doubt about that. However, they are clearly unable to secure the commitments of the Israeli military and perhaps Hamas to provide for a safe passage for these civilians. Everything my organization right now is hearing about, and we focus on the Muslim American community here and their political empowerment, is we're hearing from families in Gaza that there are no obstructions for them to leave from the Hamas side currently, but the Israelis either keep bombing or refusing to guarantee safe passage. And I think these lawsuits are only going to increase that public pressure. Domestically here, 66% of Americans support a ceasefire, by the way. 54% of Republicans do, and over 80% of Democrats. And today here in Washington, D.C., I suspect hundreds of thousands of protesters will be marching on our Capitol to voice their support for a ceasefire.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Politicians not necessarily representing public opinion in their policies. Very interesting to get your thoughts today. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, back here, the war is ratcheting up community tensions, with organisers of weekly pro-Palestinian marches criticised for scheduling a rally next weekend on Armistice Day. Suella Braverman has spoken exclusively to Sky's Ali Fortescue and said anyone found vandalising the cenotaph next weekend must be put in a jail cell faster than their feet can touch the ground. The Home Secretary is in the Greek island of Samos, where she has been learning about the Greek approach to illegal migration. Here's Sky's political correspondent, Ali Fortescue.
If there's a place that represents Europe's migration problem, this could well be it. The land border between Greece and Turkey, divided by a wall of steel. The British Home Secretary sees a model for her government.
There's a lot that we can learn from the Greeks in their methods. Their methods have been pretty controversial, including things like pushbacks. Is that the sort of example that we should be following? Well, this is a global migration crisis, and tough decisions are necessary.
But as is so often the case with Suella Braverman, domestic controversy is hard to escape. Fiercely critical of a pro-Palestine march planned for Armistice Day, she says only the police can apply for a ban.
To be clear, you don't think it should go ahead?
I think I've been pretty clear that these are hate marches. They are, I think, chanting of jihad on the streets of Britain in the 21st century is utterly despicable. And I don't see how any decent person or how the vast majority of the British people can find that to be acceptable behaviour. It's sickening.
I mean, is it unbelievable? I feel that there's probably more to this than what she's saying. There is it seems a massive mischaracterization of those marches. A few people calling out jihad is not the representative of the vast majority of people that are peaceful there, and trying to see what the British people think. I hate it when anyone does that. No one can know what the British people think unless you survey all 7 million of them. But anyway, I think there's something more to this, but then we're going to go on to this because her next bit we got after of hers is when she's talking about homeless people. I mean, this is what worries me, this sort of right wing that I was talking about previously, calling protest marches because these people are seeing children under rubble dying. I've been affected by these pictures. Lots of people have, and I can't believe she hasn't been. And yet, so people go out and protest, what you'd expect in a democratic country, and you get labelled as hate marches. And then homeless people was a lifestyle choice. I mean, this is, like I was saying at the beginning, we're heading to a very dangerous place with people like this in power who are speaking and acting very dangerously, I think. I'm going to rewind that bit to you.
Yeah, acceptable behaviour. It's sickening.
You call them hate marches. Do you think everyone on these marches is hateful, as you put it?
I think, as I say, if you've seen images of hundreds of people chanting jihad, being corralled...
So everyone, even on the fringes of these marches, is hateful?
Chanting from the river to the sea. I don't think there's any other way but to call them hate marches.
There are concerns that the cenotaph could be targeted on Armistice Day. What action should be taken if that happens?
If anyone were to vandalise the cenotaph, they must be put into a jail cell faster than their feet can touch the ground.
A fresh row today, plans to stop homeless people sleeping in tents, described by the Home Secretary as a lifestyle choice.
Surely this is something that people do out of desperation, not out of choice.
We will help those who are genuinely homeless. It cannot be right that parts of our cities are ruined and blighted by the sight and use of tents. There is no need to use tents for accommodation in 21st century Britain. It brings criminality, it brings drug use, it brings, in many instances, violence to communities.
But Suella Braverman will be judged, above all, on one pledge.
How do you think that pledge is going to stop the vote?
I think we're making progress, but there is more to do.
We're judging you on your terms here, and you haven't done anything like stop the vote.
I'm not claiming success at all, by any means, yet. We have made progress, but there is a lot more to do, and it will be pretty obvious whether we've succeeded or not.
Suella Braverman does not go on a trip abroad without attracting attention, and this was no exception. She was here to talk about immigration, but her answers were characteristically bold on a whole range of controversial domestic topics, not least pro-Palestinian marches. Remember, though, Suella Braverman is someone who wants to appeal to a chunk of the electorate and of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, the kind of Trumpian kind of populist type of thing. I don't think she should be, I don't know why anyone would be electing her in any position of power, because the thing she says is just poor people who are homeless, saying they blight. Yeah, it's right, it shouldn't be happening in the 21st century, because everyone should have a fucking house, and we shouldn't be living in the system that we're living in where this happens. I just think it's disgusting the way she's talking about some of these issues and a lack of empathy and humanity. And I think those things are very needed in this world, and especially in political positions. Without that, you shouldn't be in, no one should be voting for you.
The electorate and of the Conservative Party.
On a Border Force patrol, taking the captain's chair, an ambitious Home Secretary in her element. This is a Suella Braverman they want you to see. Her sights set on more than just stopping the boats. Ali Fortescue, Sky News, Samos in Greece.
More on the impact of the war here in the UK now. And protesters have taken to the streets in cities across the country again today, calling for a ceasefire in the Middle East. Katerina Vitozzi has more.
What do we want? Ceasefire! When do we want it? Now! What do we want?
Across the UK, today's pro-Palestine protests took many forms. Some groups blocked train stations like here in Edinburgh and London's Charing Cross. But however, and wherever people chose to take part, many carried the same message.
We want to see an immediate ceasefire. We want to see food, water, medical supplies, electricity into Gaza right now.
I'm here to protest against the killing of children, against the killing of families, the killing of innocent civilians.
Well, where's Suella Braverman's calls that everyone's calling for jihad and everyone's calling for that song from the river onwards? No one. There's probably one or two idiots that are doing it. Like there isn't any protest, probably there, planted anyway.
Urged protesters to stay local, but London's protests drew big crowds. The Metropolitan Police confirmed there had been arrests. One protester was detained for having a placard that could incite hatred. In Manchester, protesters were ringed by a strong police presence.
There have been protests like this one in cities across the UK now for several weeks, and when you look around you see various political activists, but there's also people here with families. Many have come with young children, and a lot of them have the same message, that they want the UK government to push now for a ceasefire.
Come to support the Palestinians, because it's wrong that 2,000 years ago you could take revenge on somebody, but now this is not the way to do it.
Israel has the right to defend itself, but this is something else. There's defence, and then there's going in there and just slaughtering people.
It's actually really emotional because you see little children, because I've got a little brother, and I put myself in their shoes, and I feel the pain.
Here, some use this controversial slogan as a call to end Israeli occupation of the West Bank. But for many Jewish groups, it's deeply anti-Semitic at a time of huge sensitivity and worry for UK Jewish communities.
There are plenty of Jews who are very concerned, distraught, devastated by what they're seeing with the death toll and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and they understand people wanting to rally around that or to support Palestinian civilians. But that's not all that these protests seem to be about. It can sometimes feel very confusing for us as Jews as to what exactly they are rallying behind. Is it just to support the Palestinian cause, which, by the way, I support, and I actually work with Palestinian colleagues in Israel who are doing some of that work for human rights for Palestinians? Or is it really a sense of hatred?
For now, there is no sign of these protests dwindling in number or intensity, with a larger gathering concentrated in London planned for over Remembrance Weekend. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News.
Weather now, and
to reaffirm our commitment.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get more now on the criticism of the Home Secretary after she described homelessness as a lifestyle choice and said charities could be punished for handing out tents to rough sleepers. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Polly Neate, Chief Executive of the homeless charity Shelter. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Controversial comments by the Home Secretary, once again, referring to people rough sleeping in tents as a lifestyle choice. Now, I can only imagine what your response to that will be, but go for it. What's your response?
Well, I mean, obviously, homelessness is not a lifestyle choice, first of all. And actually, you know, if the government seriously wants to prevent homelessness, ministers do know exactly how to do that. And this isn't it. You know, homelessness is because people simply cannot afford a decent place to live in this country. That includes some working people and people on low incomes. And, you know, actually, rough sleeping has increased in the last year by well over 25%. And, you know, as I say, if the government wants to end this, they know how to do it. You know, would you stop? Where are you going to end? You don't want people to be given tents. Do you not want them to be given food? Do you not want them to be given warm clothing? I mean, actually, it's in the government's power to give people a home, and that's what homelessness people need.
Yeah, let's move away from the controversy surrounding the lifestyle choice comments, which, of course, have sparked a lot of anger. Something that Suella Braverman also said is that there is no need for rough sleeping in tents, given the alternatives and support available to rough sleepers. Is that correct? In theory, no one should need to rough sleep in a tent because there are alternative options for them.
No, I mean, that isn't the case. We wouldn't be seeing people on the streets if there were enough decent and safe alternatives for them. Actually, sleeping rough is an incredibly dangerous way to live. People are often victims of assault, and people are, you know, very cold. The age of death among rough sleepers is massively younger than it is in the general population. So it's an extremely dangerous way to have to live. And, you know, people make that choice because there are not alternatives available. What people who are rough sleeping now need is somewhere to live and often other forms of support as well to help them to remain in that new home. But most importantly, we need to prevent rough sleeping in the first place, and that is by unfreezing housing benefits so that people can actually afford to pay their rent, and building homes that people on low incomes can actually afford to live in. That's the only long-term solution to the issue of homelessness.
The Home Secretary also said the UK will follow the likes of Los Angeles and San Francisco if we continue to have weak policies on rough sleeping. Now, of course, the homeless issues in those cities are like nothing I've ever seen before. Does that resonate with you? Where are the worst hit places in the UK at the moment?
Well, London is obviously a hotspot for all forms of homelessness, but actually, increasingly, this is not just a problem in London, and not even just a problem in our big cities. And, you know, there is homelessness is increasing. All forms of homelessness are dramatically increasing. That's not because we're not clamping down properly on people who are already homeless. That's because we are not implementing, the government is not implementing policies to prevent homelessness. And they know perfectly well what those policies are. They're making a political choice not to do it.
OK, Polly Neate, Chief Executive of Shelter, we really appreciate your thoughts today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
There you go. This is the world we're living in. It's terrible, really. I don't know. What can I say? Just it disgusts me to hear the lack of empathy and humanity. I mean, it's not the only way to solve. The way to solve it is to get rid of the system, get rid of money.
A very good evening. Tonight, the Palestinian Health Ministry claims dozens have been killed in airstrikes that hit the Maghazi refugee camp in central Gaza. It comes as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on a tour of the Middle East, attempting to restore calm to the region, where tensions are on a knife edge. Mr. Blinken made a surprise visit to the West Bank earlier, where he met with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to tell him the US is committed to the realization of a Palestinian state. Despite US appeals for a humanitarian pause, Israel says it will continue with its offensive to crush Hamas. Well, Sky News has spoken to a father who lost 4 of his children in the strikes on the Maghazi refugee camp. Our correspondent Mark Stone is in Jerusalem with the latest for us. A very good evening to you, Mark, and certainly more concerning reports coming out of Gaza. Another refugee camp hit, connectivity cut once again. What's the latest in Gaza tonight?
Yes, I've just tried to get in touch with our team, our local team down in Gaza, a team who have throughout this crisis and all the others before it, they have been our eyes on the ground when we're unable, as we are at the moment, ourselves to get to Gaza because the Israeli authorities are not allowing access. But we have local teams there and every day they send us the images that they film. And today's is the story of Mohammed Al-Aluli. He is a photographer himself. He is a cameraman and he was out filming last night and while he was out the refugee camp where he lives, which is incidentally south of the Wadi Gaza, the Gaza River, in the area which is supposed to be safer, it was hit by a missile strike. Now his story is replicated over and over, but he lost his 4 children. He lost his 4 siblings as well, his 3 brothers and his sister, and all of their children as well. And only his wife survives. She is in hospital now, and we've been looking at some of the truly awful pictures, and we'll bring you their story later on this evening. But a moment where he takes one of his dead children into the hospital room so that his injured wife, who is unable to leave the hospital, is able to say a final goodbye. It is one glimpse of one family of so many that are going through hell right now. As I said, the power is down in Gaza at the moment, so we haven't been able to get hold of our teams there right now. The power went down about a week ago. It was cut off by the Israelis. The Americans then said, you can't do that. You need to turn it back on. And they did. But it's been cut again now tonight. And to give you a sense, too, of the challenges beyond the deaths and the injuries. I was talking to a UN official, a senior UN official here in Jerusalem earlier on, and she told me that there are 160 litres of fuel there, 160,000 litres of fuel left in Gaza now. That will last perhaps a couple of days before the generators that are powering the hospitals and powering the sewage systems turn off. There are 9,000 cancer patients in Gaza at the moment. There are 1,000 dialysis patients. There are 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza. That's 5,000 who give birth every month. All of these people clearly in desperate need of hospitals that are not only running out of power but are also being targeted too.
And let's talk about the diplomatic efforts by Antony Blinken. Of course, that historic visit to the West Bank today and now a surprise visit to Iraq. We've had some comments from Antony Blinken in the last hour. How is his trip going, Mark? Any sign of a breakthrough?
Honestly, not very well. He wanted to be able, I think, to come to the West Bank, where we were earlier on today, to go to Ramallah and to tell the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, that he had secured a humanitarian pause. Abbas wants a full ceasefire. The Americans do not, because they think it will benefit Hamas, but they do want a humanitarian pause. But he wasn't even able to get that, and you do wonder the extent to which the Americans do not have the influence that perhaps they thought over the Israelis, because it is the Israelis who say they will not pause at the moment. The only way that they would have a humanitarian pause is if all the hostages that Hamas is still holding are released. Antony Blinken, as you said, is now in Baghdad. Another surprise visit. He spoke a few moments ago.
We have about 100 trucks a day going in. That's good, but it's grossly insufficient. So now we're working on raising that significantly so that more aid in a sustained way gets into Palestinians who need it. There again, humanitarian pause can also help advance that and create an environment in which we can do as much as possible for people who so desperately need the assistance.
And he will continue this Middle Eastern tour. Gulf countries, we believe, will be next.
OK, Mark, we appreciate your update. Thanks very much indeed. Mark Stone there, live for us in Jerusalem. Now, the continuing violence in Gaza comes against a backdrop of increasing instability in the region. Lebanon's Hezbollah leader on Friday threatened escalation with Israel. Hassan Nasrallah said that his militia is already engaged in unprecedented fighting along the Lebanon-Israel border. And he said Hezbollah was prepared for all options and fighting would not be limited to the scale seen so far. Well, our international correspondent, John Sparks, is in Beirut for us. Hello to you, John. And certainly a lot of eyes on that almost daily fire that we see between Hezbollah and Israel. A lot of concern when it comes to regional escalation. What's the latest?
Yeah, we've seen a sort of continuing barrage of tit-for-tat strikes between the Shia military faction in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and the Israeli Defense Forces. We have seen an escalation, has been a gradual escalation, but an escalation nonetheless. Today, no different. Hezbollah officials confirming that they have fired Grad missiles, 10 Grad missiles, we understand, at the Israeli city of Kiryat Shimona in North Israel. I can tell you that city has already been evacuated, but Hezbollah are striking at it. And they said that that was retaliation for an Israeli airstrike on a car traveling between two villages in southern Lebanon. They said that strike killed 3 children aged between 8 and 14 and the children's grandmother. The mother apparently survived but is injured. And they have released pictures of the girls, and they've released a statement calling it a heinous and brutal crime. Now, we have had a statement from the Israelis tonight. They've accused Hezbollah of attacking locations in Israel without distinguishing between military and civilian locations. The Israeli military spokesman said that the terrorist Hezbollah continued to destabilize security on the northern border, targeting residents indiscriminately. As you said, Sally, we heard from the leader of Hezbollah on Friday, Hassan Nasrallah. It was his first public pronouncement on the war since hostilities began on October 7th, concerns that he would open a new front in northern Israel. He didn't do that, but he said all options were open. There are rules of engagement in place that confine the hostilities to the border area. Concern, obviously, now that those rules will weaken or even break.
OK, John, thanks very much indeed. John Sparks for us there, live in Beirut. Well, back here, Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has confirmed his in-laws have returned home to Scotland from Gaza after what they described as a living nightmare. Elizabeth and Maged El Nakla had travelled to Gaza to visit family, but were unable to return home after the conflict erupted in the region. Well, in a post on social media, Humza Yousaf said, "I am pleased to say my in-laws are safe and back home. We are, of course, elated, but my father-in-law said my heart is broken in two with my mum, son and grandchildren in Gaza." He then broke down, telling me how hard it was saying goodbye to them. Now, the welcome return of the First Minister's family is
Why do we live in a world like this, huh?
Divided in two. Let's take a look at the situation as it stands. The Israeli...
I just don't understand why we live in a world like this. And it's different to distinguish through the... I suppose it's like, if you're a civilian, wherever you're living, the people that you are in control are not really looking after you, any side, it seems. We still can't stop killing each other.
From 10:30. Good evening. We begin with claims from Israel's defense forces that its troops have encircled Gaza City and effectively divided the besieged territory into two. Tonight, all communications and internet services have been cut within the Gaza Strip. And as America's top diplomat continued his tour of the region, Hamas claimed dozens of people were killed in airstrikes that hit a refugee camp in central Gaza. Well, the blast happened at the Maghazi camp, located in the evacuation zone where Israel's military had urged Palestinian civilians to seek refuge. Sky News has spoken to a man who lost 4 of his children and his 4 siblings in the strike on the camp. A warning that this report from our correspondent Mark Stone contains images you may find distressing.
It is individual moments in Gaza which reflect the enormity of all this. This is Mohammed Al-Alou. In his arms, his little boy, Kais. And he's carrying him for a final goodbye. Beyond the door, Mohammed's wife, Kais's mother, too injured to leave hospital. And so she will say goodbye to her son here. And she will do it 4 times.
It's just heartbreaking to see this father carrying his child in a bundle in a white shroud to the injured mother to say goodbye. Whether he's a Hamas soldier or she's a Hamas soldier or anyone connected, or maybe they're not even anything to do with it, they're just innocent civilians. Those children, they don't deserve this. Imagine if there was a VR set or some way that you could experience this. I wish we could put, all these suited leaders into this place so they could feel this, and then they'd want to stop it quicker rather than talking and paperwork and bureaucracy. Bastards.
Because Kais wasn't alone. He died with 3 of his siblings, Ahmed, Rahaf and Kinan. Mohammed lost 4 of his children. And he lost his 3 brothers too. And his sister and their children. His whole family.
No, actually, he's wearing a press jacket. He's the journalist, isn't the photographer. So he's press.
One after the other, they are lifted to be taken for burial. This is what dignity has become in Gaza. So much loss, there isn't space in the back. His firstborn will come with him. They were here at home on Saturday night when the missile hit. Like all the refugee camps here, Al-Makazi is a town. It is an area where they were told by the Israelis that they would be safer. There are believed to be more families beneath the rubble. With Mohammed's agreement, our team in Gaza followed him for the burial, a drive that is replicated across this strip of land. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to them, he says. He left for work early to film other people's grief that is now his. And so the final steps of this journey into a cemetery already prepared for so many. And then the rage spills over. He is the man who runs the cemetery. Are these Hamas fighters, he shouts? Are these Hamas commanders? He's speaking in Hebrew. The message is for Israel. God will help us to take our revenge, he says. It is a statement that hints at so many troubles ahead. Here, now, they bury their families themselves. And so, side by side, together, so many from one family are laid to rest. Mark Stone, Sky News in Jerusalem.
Well, earlier, the Jordanian Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi told Sky News a 2-state solution is the only way to move forward.
We will not accept a Gaza alone approach. Gaza alone is unacceptable. What needs to be done is a comprehensive peace plan that addresses both the situation in Gaza, the West Bank, and it should be based on and geared towards a comprehensive solution that will result in the establishment of a viable southern Palestinian state.
Lebanese state media say 3 children and their grandmother have been killed in a car by an Israeli airstrikes. The IDF says it has targeted terrorist vehicles. Also tonight, an Israeli military spokesman says 1 person has been killed by an anti-tank missile fired by Hezbollah from Lebanon. And this comes as the US Secretary of State has continued his diplomatic tour, visiting the Palestinian president.
Just imagine if it was your child, you went to work and you came home to find your child dead. It doesn't matter whether there's a Muslim child or an Israeli child or a Christian child or an agnostic child or an atheist child, a child of any nation or whatever. This is a human child. One existence of life ended in rubble in the 21st century at the hands of humans. It doesn't matter, this is happening in all wars. There's always happening wars. And these suited people going around just speaking words and not really feeling what's going on. I don't know how we continue to live like this, and I'm sure I'm not the first to feel this. Mothers and fathers have felt this through generations of wars, as humans don't seem to ever evolve out of killing each other and wanting to fight over land and control. When will we learn? Take care, take it easy, God bless, and peace.